All right. Third time on the podcast, Eric. Nice to have you back.
Always a pleasure, man. Always a pleasure. It was funny the past few weeks as we've been talking, and you're like, God, we gotta smash the record button again. Yeah, it's definitely about time.
Yeah. No, every conversation feels like a podcast. So it's just like, yeah, let's just record one of these. So today, so for anyone that hasn't listened to the past two, we've spoken a lot about cultural architecture, about the project that we're both deeply engaged with, Phoenix culture, um, hedonic engineering, a lot of these different concepts that we've been writing about on both of our newsletters and been exploring, sort of in tandem, along with the sort of topics of decentralization as a lever for enacting some of these cultural architecture visions that we both hold. So today I want to continue on the cultural architecture topics and the cultural frequency topics, because it feels like to me every time we hop on a podcast, like our thinking is becoming more nuanced and more complex and more hitting the core levers and like more just direct. So I want to like talk about a lot of the similar topics and themes that we discussed on the last episodes, but also like see how much more direct and focus we can get on like how do you actually enact cultural architecture? What are the aspects of it? Talking about not only the topic, but also like what are some different areas that we can actually begin taking action on? How can we make it more tangible for the listeners? And then I would also love to discuss decentralization as a lever, as it seems we've both gone pretty deep into that as well. So yeah, how does that sound?
Sounds perfect. I mean, I think this is actually why the entire kind of meme and idea of Phoenix culture first came up. It was just, what does a potential synthesis of all of these branches actually look like? Like, what does the collective whole come together as? And yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing inquiry as much as it is anything else. So, I mean, I'm ready. Let's go.
Amazing. So let's start with just a base synthesis of cymatics and cultural frequency and sort of the Schmachtenberg idea of generator functions and sort of the idea of like, the way to enact culture, like how do we actually enact cultural change? What does that look like? What are some mental models for that? So I guess I could just start off. I'll just start off with my understanding of it, and then whatever pops up for you, feel free to add in. So like I love this concept that you brought to me called around cymatics, which is when you put sound on like a plate with some powder, it like creates this geometric pattern, and as you change the frequency, it increasingly makes the pattern more complex until it just like shifts into a new pattern, and then it does the same thing. And so it feels like we can use that as a really good it feels like a really solid mental model for how does culture develop, right? And so it's like culture is not linear in the sense of like we have like everyone as a culture is operating on a certain like cymatic frequency. And the idea, what it feels like to me, like the core vision of Phoenix culture and how I understand it is like we're trying to like play with and toy with the levers of that frequency, and we're trying to figure out how can we actually increase the frequency of culture itself so that a different like there are many physical manifestations of culture, but if we're trying to go a little bit more fundamental than most of the stuff, and we're just trying to be like what are the sort of experience level frequencies that we can play with and start to develop, and how do we actually know if, I think a question I've been asking myself a lot these days is how do we actually know if we're developing that lever? Like what are the metrics for that? Are there metrics? Can you have metrics, or is it beyond metrics? Is it totally like really hard to pin down to a metric? And then also like, yeah, I think this topic, we could talk about this for 10 hours, but like I think just going from here, like whatever branches off I'm excited to speak on it. So I'm curious how that landed in terms of your understanding of what Phoenix culture is, or what the sort of cymatic as frequency, as like kind of cultural transformational process, like model, like how does that land with you, or how do you understand that model?
Yeah, beautifully put. Yeah, the way cymatics came up for me is, I mean, I think the mental model term was fantastic. Uh, to me, it just lands as there's a, in the case of cymatics specifically, there's a frequency of sound that inevitably, like without question, generates a physical pattern in the world. And I mean, if you look at, I mean, walk down any major city, like every major city, every urban environment more or less actually looks the same, quite frankly. Even regardless of where you go in the world, there's still like grids, big buildings, lots of concrete. Like there is a cultural societal frequency that generated that pattern. At least that's how it lands for me. And that idea is unbelievably powerful. The second thing we've spoken about this. I think you've written about this. I've also written about it in the cultural architecture piece, the idea of ontological design, that it's a feedback system. So Phoenix culture has been both. I think it's an attempt to explore both sides. I've also likened it to like a DNA double helix, like two sides of the strand. One is the internal individual or collective state that you're coming from that shapes the world, and inevitably how that world then comes back and shapes the individual. And it's an ongoing feedback cycle. And I don't think we necessarily need to reiterate all of this, but there are many strong, data driven, highly compelling arguments that if the feedback loop that we're currently on continues much longer, it's not going to take us into a very good place. Um, yeah, potentially world ending place. So I guess that brings you back to a fundamental point of, okay, something needs to change. Arguably, both things need to change: the actual external environment that shapes the people, and the individual people that then go out and shape the environment. Um, and yeah, that's why I said this was an ongoing inquiry, because it's like, okay, well, what does that actually look like? How can you change? How can you fundamentally alter the state or the place a person is coming from? Are they coming from, we were just touching on this before hitting record, like are they coming from fear, guilt, shame? You could call them negatively valenced emotions as their primary fuel source for any form of action, or are they coming from love, service, wholeness, creativity, inspiration, synergy? Because inevitably, like this goes back to the fundamental principle of cymatics, like where you are coming from, and it can be expanding circles, where the individual, where the family unit, where the friend unit, where the neighborhood unit is coming from, will without fail shape what the world looks like and what their collective impact on the world is. um, and yeah, so I think the two of us have been exploring and have been developing our own interest in the levers that individuals can use to kind of, you know, clean their rooms, sort their own shit out, really clean or purify their own frequency. And also, what are the macro tools and technologies that you can also use at the same time? So we've done a lot of awakening, emotional, interpersonal practices. There's a whole gamut of really good individual practices. And there are a lot of emerging or largely established kind of technologies, mental models for the collective external frame that work really well. Decentralization, I think crypto has something to it. Um, there's a Yeah, and I think for me, Phoenix culture has been the middle ground of like, okay, what does a community, what does a collective, or what does an individual who's actually there operating from that state, using the tools available and uh, working on where they're coming from, what does it actually look like? And it is that is a good rabbit hole to follow. You're muted.
Yeah, there's a couple things I want to touch on for that. We were speaking about this right before we hit record as well. It feels like one of the insights from the ontological design point feels very salient to me these days, which is like the system interacts with the person and the person interacts with the system, and they kind of co-interact, which affords the insight that working on the individual, like it's both valuable to work on the system and the individual, and none is either better or worse. There's no hierarchy of better or worse in terms of like, should we work on the individual, should we work on the system, should we work on like working with political games and economic games, or individual sort of levers. And it's like, no, like every project that someone is doing has you could almost say equal amount of value, but like has a value on both the systems change work, the work that people like. If someone's trying to do you know, like positive activism, environmental activism, like kind of sort of externally focused systems change stuff, that is actually also having an impact on the internal state of the collective as well, just by like the nature of the insight of ontological design. And then vice versa, you know, we can also say like, I think the insight that's coming to me is like the demonization as a whole just breaks down. Like you can't demonize anyone. If it's like, if someone's like doing all the activist work, then it's like, oh, but you're not doing the internal work. It's like, no, actually they're shifting the way that we experience life internally as a culture. And then similarly, if someone's doing a bunch of activist work and they're like, oh, but you don't care about the environment, like you gotta like support the environment like I do. And it's like, no, but actually focusing on my internal self is having an impact on how we view the environment. And so like they're it's like so like it's so profoundly like co-arising all of these different things, which I think is an insight that has really shaped me recently. And you know, I wanted to bring up a frame from Vervaeke as well here, because as you were speaking about the sort of downward spiraling process, you know, the feeling that I get from that is like, oh shit, like if the system interacts with the person and the person interacts with the system, and it's like this like feedback loop, then if we're already going down, how the hell do we start going up? Like we already have this negative feedback loop going, you know, with culture. And so like it like the first feeling I get is sort of like hopelessness and like apathy. But I really enjoyed Vervaeke's frame. He speaks about in his episode called Buddhism and Parasitic Processing. He talks about you know, Buddhism as like he says the essence of Buddhism is that like it is a way to counteract the sort of negative feedback loop and like what he calls parasitic processing of like, you know, losing sovereignty, losing agency, falling into apathy, shame, guilt, all these like very negative emotions that you're talking about that on a cultural level are very endemic. You know, it feels like we're just spiraling downwards. And like a lot of times I have that feeling like as a culture, we're just like, we're going super deep into these, all sorts of these negative emotions. But he speaks on like, there are certain psychotechnologies that are actually in the same way that the negative feedback loop is like feeds in on itself in a very, you know, adaptive way. You know, if you try to do one thing, it's not necessarily going to stop the downward spiral. You can't just like try to reduce like the whole process down to one part and say, if we just change this one thing, then we can get on an upward spiral. Like that's not how it works. But he actually speaks on this core insight that like we can actually build an equally adaptive reinforcing feedback loop, you know, upward spiraling feedback loop. And so, you know, the way that I approach this sort of cultural frequency, cultural architecture thing is like, I guess another frame I wanted to add is like the work that it feels like we're doing here is like trying to build the most adaptive feedback loop in the other direction to counteract the already existent adaptive feedback loop in the negative direction.
Well, and I mean, wow, that's actually such a nice take, because I mean, there's two parts to the Phoenix culture meme, right? One is the culture and one is the Phoenix. And there's a very real reason the Phoenix mythology came up, is because one of the one of the problems, or actually one of, you could say, the inevitable outcomes of parasitic processing, reciprocal narrowing, is that you eventually get to the state of like, I can't do anything else. I see fundamentally no other option for what my life is like right now and how I act and how the world is. You actually, it's a complete, it's a, in a way, it's a loss of agency. It's a loss of belief. It's a loss of a lot. And I think there's actually part of that happening culturally, collectively right now, which is, well, this is kind of it, man. This is the best we got. This is exactly how it's going to unfold. There's too much momentum being built. The snowball's already rolling down the mountain, gathering momentum, and it's like you can see the similarities in that thing. And
Mm,
that's actually why, again, the Phoenix mythology was so central in this idea of like, actually, yeah, if you really want to be, this also applies individually as well. If you really want to change, like deep, any true personality identity change involves essentially a death of the old self. And depending on like what aspect of your life you're trying to change, it can feel that way too. Like there's a part of you that is actually dying. There's a small part of you that just cannot exist anymore.
mm,
Right. And sometimes it's the part of you that's addicted to meth. And it's like, even though it's something that you might wish was different, it's still actually difficult. The change in and of itself is extremely difficult because it's the known, it's part of your identity, it's got its own momentum to itself. And so this ethos of continued death and rebirth was actually very fundamental, because as you, there is, I see two parts, and I see them, I think you can do both at the same time. One is, yes, you can flip things, change momentum. First, you can slow the momentum, stop it so that you can then
right, right.
build momentum and start the upward spiral. But there's another part of me, this is kind of the sunk cost fallacy writ large of society, which is like, don't spend, don't keep making a mistake just because you spent a long time making it. Like, just drop the thing. Like if it's not actually working out, like there's actually a wisdom in knowing when to quit, basically. And there is a, on my more radical days, like there is just an open question of like, how the fuck do I just quit this whole thing? Like the thing is not working. I
Mm,
don't actually want to kind of slowly extricate myself from it. Like I just, like, how can I check out of this thing? And yeah, there's uh pros and cons to both of that, but there's a, one of the easiest ways you can help something lose momentum is to stop feeding it energy. That's almost a very fundamental like physics point. Like stop feeding it energy, and man, it becomes a very challenging or confronting question when the thing you have to stop feeding is public media, the fiat financial system, like the energy system,
yeah,
people's negativity. Like, oh my God, this is also why, again, it's inseparable and necessary. The individual work is inseparable and necessary because you could, most people have probably seen an example of it in their own lives. If you're sitting in a group of maybe half a dozen to a dozen people and everyone's maybe complaining about something, someone's really sad, like you can actually feel the emotion, the emotional state of the group on
mm,
this downward spiral. But if you just root the fuck down and actually hold something like, yeah, this is not great, but it's okay, you can actually almost collectively by yourself start switching that momentum, or at
mm,
least, at the very least, cutting cutting the process off to a halt. And it gives people that space of like, oh yeah, maybe it's not that bad, or like, how are you still positive or optimistic in given all the facts? And it's like, actually, they're both necessary. And if you can hold and really cultivate that frequency, and again, the challenge and opportunity here is, if we can collectively do that, if increasing groups of people and networks of people can actually hold a vision, hold a frequency, and take ridiculous action towards it, I think we can, and almost certainly need to do that to start shifting the momentum, to start actually carrying us into collective way of being into a culture that is, yeah, at the very least symbiotic with nature,
Mhm.
symbiotic with the biosphere, just moving away from anything other than cataclysm and existential risk.
For sure, for sure. Mm. Yeah, I wanna bring up this frame that I think is generative here of game change. And so there's there's this really interesting frame that I came across recently of like game denial and game change. And I think it's going to add a lot to a lot of what you were just saying. And so there's this sort of, if we take this into the sort of sociological, political, like the sort of out like the outer facing lens for a second, we can see that there's like different ways that people approach like society and how they feel about society, right? And so typically the sort of reduction, like reducing the point down a little bit, the sort of summary of it is that in society, especially in like the US, we have like two sort of camps, like the left and the right. The left tends to be game, um, so there's like game denial. I can't remember what the left is, but it's like basically let's just change all of the games. All of the games are bad. Let's just like cop out of all the games. Let's just, or I guess, yeah, so it'd be that the left would be game denial. So like the left is like this game denial perspective where it's like the game is bad. All the games and the incentives of the current capitalist system, of the current democratic system, are flawed, and they're leading to, mega billionaires and environmental degradation and all of this stuff. And so like let's just like cop out of the whole game and just like stop playing it. And so like that's the sort of left perspective. And then the sort of right perspective is no, but there's a reason that this game has lasted so long. So like let's not just like ditch the whole game and just like try to just like ditch the game entirely. Like there's a reason that this game exists. But then it also tends to go too far in the other direction often, in terms of like you can't change the game. This is just how it's always been. So why would you try to change the game? So like there's these two camps, and both of them are equally flawed in their own right. One is too rigid in not wanting to change it, and one is too rigid in wanting to change everything and not realizing that there's anything valuable in either one. And so the middle ground that it feels like we're playing in with the sort of cultural change, it's like cultural change is like, I guess the middle ground, the synthesis of those two would be game change, which is there are valuable aspects of this game that are, there's a reason that this game has lasted so long, because it actually helps us, the current capitalist game, sure, it's flawed, but it actually helps to create coherence among billions of people, even if it has like very negative externalities. Like it's actually effective in doing something. Without that game, if you went to a previous game, such as just like tribalism, that wouldn't work at the scale of society that we have today. And so like it's actually effective in very, even if it's limited and we need to change the game. And then on the other hand, there are parts of the game that need to be changed. So like what are the values of the game already that we're already playing, and also how do we change it in a generative way? And so I have a lot of resistance myself, like to a lot of these. There's a lot of people that are like really trying to like do game change, but then the actions I see a lot of people taking are, I'm just going to go completely off grid and just do completely regenerative agriculture. And it's like you're kind of just like copping out of the game entirely, rather than saying, all right, regenerative agriculture is a very good project to promote, but how do we actually like integrate it into the game, rather than like trying to extricate it from the game and just live like out in the jungle by ourselves and just like not even interact with the game at all? Or I guess what we've been exploring with this sort of decentralization theme has been like, what is a new game that we can play, or just like trying to think about that. And I think we talked about this a lot before. It's been front and center of my mind for a while, of like, you know if we take Vervaeke's frame of like agent arena relationship, it's like if I'm interacting in the arena of the sort of capitalist system, or the sort of market dynamics, or the financial or political, all these different games that you talked about, like that are causing so much of these negative reciprocal narrowing loops on a collective level, if I'm feeding it, like if I'm playing those games and I'm just like assuming that that's like the game that needs to be played, I'm actually like perpetuating all of these things that I don't want to see in the world. So like, what when you ask the question of like, well, what does it look like to, be sovereign? Like, what is this, like a sovereign agent in this sort of like cultural frequency agent arena relationship? It's like what comes up for me is asking the question of like, what are the games I'm playing, and how might we change those games to be more generative on a collective and individual level. And there's always going to be games, and I think the frame that I've really appreciated from Hansi Freinacht is you're never going to get to the end point, right? The only thing we can do is iterate on the games we have right now. We're not trying to create the perfect game. We're just trying to take the flawed but useful game that we have right now, and we're trying to just upgrade it one step, knowing that we will upgrade it again after that. But our only focus right now is upgrading it one step. And so, all right, so we have the games, we can, we can feel in and sense into the games that we're playing right now, and but then also realize like, what are certain levers to like actually kind of change these games a little bit. And so like one of the levers that comes to mind first is like the economic game. So it's like, all right, right now a vast majority of people in the world are complete survival mode in the economic game. So like, what if we could like create a game where less people felt so much in the survival mode, and they can actually continue playing the economic game, but focus more on intrinsic motivation rather than survival drives. Like that's like one like lever we could like play with. But like in the same way, there's like 1,000 other levers like just like that with all the other systems. So yeah, I'm curious what came up for you with all of that. That was a lot, but
All good stuff. All good stuff. Oh, I mean, man, I still find myself guilty of several of the things that you were just talking about. Right? It's not straightforward. One of the things that came up as for why people, I think, I mean, I've definitely felt this in myself. I can almost speak personally here. If we go back to the cymatic frequency talk, like if we look at the current game, the current state of things, I think one of the things that compels people to want to just check out of everything is everything I interact with is endemic of that frequency, right? The political sphere, the actual architectural societal sphere, the people I interact with, like my whole life, the financial system, everything I interact with is just a result of this frequency. And I don't want to be in that thing, period. So of course, it kind of gets reduced down to a binary at that point. It's like, well, I'm either in the thing or I'm out of it. And so if I have my choice, I'm going to choose to be out of it. Um, I think you correctly articulated that that's actually probably not the best move. Because if you think you are highly agentic and sovereign and have the ability and have some capital behind you, some cultural capital, whatever it is, to actually make things happen, it's actually probably more useful that you're still in the game, actually being like a Trojan horse, like working from the inside and actually messing with some of the structures inside than just completely going off. And in a way, actually, maybe it's not as fair to say it's like a running away or pulling away from, but yeah, in a way, it's highly self-serving. Actually, I think of something like I see it now a lot, and I mean, I felt it myself, and I still think there is an argument for the people, yeah, going down into the jungles, going off into the forest, and building the regenerative villages, stuff like that. But there's a kind of Titanic metaphor of like, yeah, women and children first, something like that. Like, there's a part of me, you're talking about a lever, and the kind of scarcity survival reality of the vast majority of the human population right now. It's like, look, if you really wanted to do something, wouldn't you focus on like education in India or Africa? Like actually just leveling out the vast majority of the human population that is still in subsistence living would probably be a stronger move than damn near anything else you're going to work on. And I mean, that's still I can flip that around on myself and even this entire project just as readily, right? Like I still have deep desire plans, hopes to, yeah, build a regenerative space, build an attractor beacon for the people who want to do this stuff, but still recognizing of like, yeah, even the thing you're building right now is probably not the thing. And that is again the kind of Phoenix mythology at once. It's like even the destination you want to get to. And I agree actually that the argument that there is a destination is flawed. This is the kind of finite infinite games frame. Um, yeah, it does almost always come back to God, all you need to do is take one step forward, man. It's not about where the marathon is going to take you. It's like, what is the goddamn next aligned step? Um, and yeah, it actually comes back. It comes back very beautifully. And I think it's highly confronting for a lot of people. It's been highly confronting for me, which is still like, oh, you're probably just still pointing fingers, right? Okay, you can make the argument that things are in a downward spiral, that they're going poorly. And yet, what are you doing today about it? How are you cleaning yourself out? Are you getting away from the financial system that you don't support? Or are you still just deeply rooted in it? Are you actually trying to make more money in that system? Like there's a point of the conversation where you just have to basically look at yourself in the mirror and be like, what am I willing to do about this today? What is the step I'm going to take today about this? Um, yeah, and I can say that because I've noticed it as I've been having more conversations with people in this space. It's like it is fantastic to see the energy that's coming up around this. And actually now more than ever, I can see online the entire regenerative finance, the refi, DeFi space, like particularly seeing like there's a whole like cohort of Gen Z actually coming online specifically in these spaces. It is deeply inspiring, but there is still I mean that has in itself baked in the hero savior mentality, which is also very dangerous. This is my entire problem to solve. I'm going to fix the world's problems instead of just doing what is mine to steward. It is, yeah, it's not straightforward, and I think almost all the way back, this is again one of the things I think we both collectively want to build um, in this space is a space for people to come to both do the work they've identified that they can do and actually have some of the incredibly difficult conversations of like, okay, what is the next step for us to take? Where can we actually go be involved in the collective single step forward? Because yeah, though it is growing, though the excitement is here, it is still a arguably far too small cohort of people who are very much like, oh, this needs to happen like now. It actually needed to happen like a few decades ago, but you know, the second best time is right here, right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where I'm at with it.
Hell yeah. Yeah, I wanna bring up the point that like just because it's a small cohort doesn't mean it can be fucking massively have a massive transformation on society. And I think that's where we're both coming from is like, you know, a lot of this what you were pointing to with this sort of hero mentality, it almost comes from this like feeling of like, oh, if like I don't get the entire world on board with this, then it's like then it failed, you know. And when it's like no, actually having a small cohort of people that are like have a lot of they can hit key lever points in the games that we're playing can actually change culture massively in ways that are really hard to, you know, see like the direct cause effect relationship of. But I was reading this example this morning of, you know, so if we take the sort of developmental level value meme sort of frame, we can see like, all right, there's like pre-modernism, modernism, postmodernism, metamodernism, or whatever. And basically, so the frame was, all right, there are certain cultural norms that have changed across the entire culture because a small subset of people in the postmodern value meme got degrees of power in, say, the US or in European countries in these governments. And then they changed the rules of the game with their power that ended up having like kind of, you know, it just trickled down to the rest of the culture. And so the example was like the LGBTQ gay rights movement, right? So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, gay rights was actually like not a big topic, and it was like the cultural norm was like, yeah, it's not okay. Like there was still a lot of cultural just homophobia, and that was just seen as normal. Like that there wasn't anyone like trying to fight against it. It was just seen as normal. And then enough people kind of develop into this postmodern value meme, and they're like, and then you know, the value of freedom, you should be able to like, you know, love anyone you want. And then it's like, you know, a very small subset of people took that insight of like, oh, like let's sexual equality, sexual liberation, LGBTQ rights, gay rights, all this stuff. Like it wasn't like the whole culture that got on board with that idea. It was a small subset of people that ended up creating different laws, cultural norms. They started fighting for it in these political arenas. And then within 2 decades, you know, our entire culture, it's seen as normal. Like it's now the tables have turned where it's like extremely culturally, you know, if you are still homophobic and you're against gays and LGBTQ rights, you're almost shunned on a cultural level. And like the mass of people and culture tend to be, you know, supportive of these things, which like 30 years ago wasn't even the case. And like there was the example of like there was even a really liberal philosopher, Eric Fromm, in like the late, you know, 20th century, and he was super homophobic. Does it mean like it's just because that was the cultural norms of his day? He was actually like super liberal, but like, you know, now that a small subset of people have changed the rules of the game, it has had an effect on entire culture. And I really like that frame because it's very empowering. You know, when I feel that, like, oh, it's actually, I feel very disempowered if I think about like, oh, I need to like, you know, solve global warming with my one project. I need to create the most all-encompassing project to like solve all of the world's problems. And that's kind of the feeling that I get in a lot of these different groups, where like that's the feeling I've had for a long time. You know, whenever I try to get into this sort of climate change, regeneration, systems change, you know, circles. And, you know, to actually like take the other frame of like, let's develop a small subset of just like, let's just develop like extreme mastery in a not very large subset of people. And then what are the most powerful levers that we can change that it can actually affect, you know, that can actually have change the rules of the game itself. And so, yeah, I guess I just feel that that's a very empowering frame that I've discovered recently that I wanted to share. And so like, yeah. What do you got on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think it all really comes together. First, really appreciate your almost correction there, and I totally agree. Like, um, a line I really like is slowly at first, then suddenly all at once. Like, yeah, actually, almost every major cultural shift has come from the small but mighty cohort at the beginning. Um, Extremely important to recognize. I still feel that's fundamentally true. Uh, if anyone has ever read Power versus Force by David Hawkins, I think that's an example, because this will actually go immediately back into the cymatic frequency thing, where if you just convey, if you exude a strong enough, clear enough signal, I mean, in a cheeky way, I think this is actually what the spiritual community uses as manifestation, right? But if you just command a level of power, certainty, clarity, the world restructures itself around you. And in a way, this is what capitalism and modern culture has done. It is a very singular narrative. It's a very commanding power that, yeah, literally shaped the world to the extent that we now have the Anthropocene of like man-made geological change. Like it is I think one thing that is, I mean, it still settles in for me regularly is like, it is possible. That's a huge just point of like, yeah, if we have humanity over its history has not yet proven what the limit of that meme is. Like if you actually set your mind to it, you can do it. If you actually command a level of forceful of power with clarity and take action behind it, we have not yet proven what we cannot do. Yes, there's a time lag, but like gotten into outer space, done some crazy shit at the subatomic level. Like it's actually possible. So given that, there's been another term coming up for me that I hope I can do a fair enough job explaining, called the Schelling point. This is still like somewhat new for me. If someone wanted to Google it, I think the Gitcoin community is doing a fantastic job of really espousing this. The way I understood it is when players of a game are confronted with choices, there is a kind of what is the most effortless, obvious choice to make. The example given was something like, say you had to meet up with someone in New York City, and that was it. Neither of you could talk to each other. Where would you go? And the example was something like the train station at noon, right? And actually, like, I mean, that answer came from polling a bunch of people. Hey, if you had to meet with someone in New York City, where would you go? That was all the information you had. The average response was metro station noon, just because it's like, oh, well, this is where people come when they visit. Noon is a pretty reasonable time of day. It's, all that stuff. That was the Schelling point of that. And so the open question for me was, how do you make a culture, an individual and a collective way of being that is just obviously the answer? Like, not because you need to make the intellectual argument, because no one, what's that line? You can't reason someone out of an opinion that they didn't reason themselves into. No one reasoned themselves into this. We were just grew up in it, conditioned by it, a participatory part of it. Um, and yeah, there's always been this question of just, well, how do you make something so compelling that people of their own volition want to come to it? One of the last times we spoke, I used the Tesla example. Tesla's almost doing that, where it's not an intellectual argument. People just want to do it because it's cool. It makes them feel good. It's a better quality, like all of those things. It's just of its own gravitas bringing people there. It's like, oh, you want to get a car? Yeah, get a Tesla. Like it's now become like the Schelling point of the automobile industry. And so, yeah, there's this. And I'll finish and tie this off by saying the to me the inevitable answer of what people would choose, of what like culture or group to participate in, is the one who is living and embodying the best version of life that they can see. Because most people, I've done a lot of most of my work has been facilitating groups of people and helping them through individual change. And most people, when I look at them, are not totally stoked about their lives. You can see this in more obvious examples like the increasing rate of suicide in culture, right? It's just like collectively people are very unhappy with the state of things. Um, and yeah, instead of yelling at them, this was the angry activist archetype. Instead of yelling at them and telling them they suck, literally just live, embody, and radiate a different way of doing it, that it just becomes the obvious, effortless, natural choice to do. And I think over time, um, it would have to include things like symbiosis with nature, honor the sovereignty of the individual and the collective. Um, yeah, opportunities for growth, love, and connection. And so then we loop all the way back of like, yeah, the open question, the open meme with Phoenix culture has been, let's do that. Let's do that. Let's get the group together, put out the bat signal, and start actually just living, building, and embodying that exact power, that exact frequency that just becomes the inevitable. At a very cheeky example, I think Game B is trying to do this as well, which is like, okay, you have to imagine when you were 16 after growing up, you were given the opportunity to like choose the culture that you wanted to live in. And it was like between game A or game B, and just trying to make the Schelling point, just trying to make the inevitable answer of like, oh yeah, well, of course I'm going over here. And that has been the ongoing exploration of this as well.
Mm. Yeah, super solid, super solid. Yeah, what's come up for me a lot has been the way that I've related with a lot of what you just said has been, what are the different aspects and parts of that development and that embodiment, right? So for me, it feels like a lot of the talk in this space is very cognitive, and I fall into this trap a lot of like, developing the cognitive frameworks of understanding this stuff. I've had like repeated wake up calls like recently around, oh shit, what are like the other development, like how do I actually embody this such that like, all right, I can, like, I've noticed in myself, like, all right, I see the sort of mastery of the mental frameworks deepening, with time. But then I'm like, oh shit, like I went from like this level of math, like I've mastered this mental framework, but yet when I go out in the world, I'm still feeling shame. I'm still interacting from these negative valence emotions. I'm still, you know, I don't have the feeling that if someone came up to me, they're like, I want what he has. Like I want to embody what that dude has. Like I don't, it doesn't feel like that's the experience. I'm actually, still, there's still the feeling, the sort of deeply rooted, envy, comparison, shame, emotions as I'm going about my day. And so, recently I've had a lot of wake up calls with that in terms of like the cognitive component seems absolutely fundamental, but also how what is the best way to take this sort of all this amazing cognitive, just like, there's so many different frames which we can mold and like co-creatively just like work with, and just like there's so much creativity potential here in terms of like what we can do cognitively. But I think for me, where I've been sort of focusing my energy is like, how do I like take all of this really just good like Lego pieces and then use them to like enact other embodiment on other levels that are not cognitive, right? So like, what are, sure, we can like understand it, but what is an actual system that will get me a different experience of life such that I go out and it, like your example of being in a group of like 10 to 15 people, and then you just like hold a different frequency and you like kind of shift the container. Like for me, like I haven't had that experience very often, and I'm like, all right, what is it like, what is like the phenomenological experience of that situation, of going out in the world, interacting with large groups of people or even small groups of people, and just like having a different experience of life. Like that's the only way I can put it, is like, what is it like to actually just develop oneself to the point where when one interacts with the world, it's just a different experience than how one's interacting with the world now. And that's what I see a lot of the sort of cultural frequency collective development as. It's like, we spoke, earlier about the different emotional regimes in terms of, back in an historical standpoint, society started out with like a fear regime. You govern people through fear. If they didn't do this, you would chop off their hand if they stole something, and then it was the guilt one. If you don't do this, you're going to hell. And then now it's the shame one. you know if you do something wrong, you will be shunned by all your peers and you will be a lonely outcast. Like that's what motivates a lot of people, is like, not being an outcast, having social, having a large friend group and network, and having status. Like these are the things that motivate us most now. And so then my experience has been like, I guess where I was going with that was the sort of cultural development feels like it's a very cognitive. The cognitive is the component of it, but it feels like the more core than that is like, how do we actually change the fundamental experience of how people exist in our culture? Do we feel shame, envy, guilt, anger, jealousy? Do we blame? Do we point fingers? Do we externalize, project? Like, are these the emotions that the vast majority, or these the states that the vast majority of people are coming from, or is it a different state? And we've talked about this a lot. And so I guess my the topic that I would want to, set out on the table here is like, how have you been approaching and thinking about how do you actually shift the lived experience of someone, in culture on an individual level, what have you been exploring in this sort of topic?
Damn, awesome. Awesome. Yeah, again, want to underscore the point you just made there, right? Of essentially mental masturbation. Feels really good to sit at your computer, watch dozens of hours of highly complex topics and be like, I got the whole thing figured out. I'm all good. And then never call your mom. And it's like, you have to see something off there. Um, yeah. Okay. So let's see where we get to with this. Um, one of the things that came up while you were speaking was one of the ways I think you can judge if it's basically, how do you feel about yourself in your heart of hearts? Are you someone you would actually want to spend time with? Are you someone, I called this the something like the cultural categorical imperative, where it's like, if everyone lived like you, exactly like you live, not the way you think you live in your head, if they literally lived exactly like you and embodied what you embodied, would you like that? Do you think that would actually be a good place to live? Would it actually be any different of a place to live? Right? That question is that can sort out a lot, quite frankly. Where it's like, yeah, how much of you comes from fear, guilt, shame, right? Kind of lower base emotions. How much of your action is inspired by love, mastery, wisdom, compassion, care? It's far too easy to push those things off as like, yeah, whatever, hippy dippy nonsense. But it's like, no, this is the root of it. This is literally the root of the things motivating your action. I maybe I'll try some of my own examples and see if we can generalize it out. Um, because again, I think you pointed to it. I can definitely point myself to it. Of a lot of these things I can point to, I can only point to because I've fallen prey to them ridiculously too many times. Right, way too much time spent thinking, a lot less time spent doing. An interesting question I think for people is, what is the optimal ratio between learning and doing? And then maybe adding on to that, what is your actual lived ratio of learning versus doing? Because it's definitely not like 90-10, right? 90% of your time learning stuff, 10%. Maybe it is. Do you think it's 50-50? Do you think it's 10-90? I think actually the people I would want to be most influential in the world are the ones doing the least in the world. They're doing the most in their head. They're doing their most in the noosphere, in the realm of ideas. But I see entire communities, entire subcultures, entire movements literally stuck behind Zoom calls. And I've been there, like straight up. I'm not trying to point fingers and act like I haven't done this. I haven't continued to. I've also started recognizing that very fucking directly. And some of mine have been very basic. For example, I'm largely awful at taking care of my relationships, or actually being a member of my relationships. Most of my social interactions, it applies to you as well. Like, I'm often very reactive, right? I kind of wait for people to message me because I'm quote unquote just happy being by myself. Like, it's cool if someone wants to talk to me. Like, is that the fucking world I want to live in? Like, absolutely not. Like, I'm much more happy to, sit and write a white paper than I am to call my family unprovoked. Right. So actually, like, even just the question of like, is your work actually more important than your relationships? Like, really sitting with that. Because for me, the answer's certainly been no, my relationships have not been more important with my work. Is that the world I want to live in? Absolutely not. So trying to actually take steps on that, cultivate more call times with people, connect with people, be more social. I had a very confronting experience 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. I'm currently living in Argentina, and we went camping out into the countryside. And I mean, my partner and I are both quite minimal. We ran quite lean on that. We had some meat and a sleeping bag and a tent, and that was basically it. And went out one day, had a mushroom journey, and coming back in the evening. I mean, it's approaching winter time here right now, and so it was like 5 or 6 degrees out. We only had one sleeping bag that didn't quite close, and so there were a few nights where I was like really fucking cold. And there was another where we the same day where we'd come back, and I realized I'd never really grown. I'd also very rarely like grilled or prepared my own food. And it was a very confronting evening of like, it was actually extremely beautiful for me. I had a whole experience around just like, oh, this is what humanity has done for tens and tens of thousands of years without fail for me to be here. It was a very like historical or ancestral connection for me. But I was crying a lot there, both from my own and just our collective, just fundamental disconnection from life because you're stuck in the realm of ideas, like completely disconnected from nature, completely disconnected from community and relationship. And so, like, this is almost what we were starting to point to um, a little earlier in the conversation of like, just take the goddamn first step. Like, you've probably got enough knowledge. Um, like, cultivate a community, learn how to goddamn make your own fucking food. That's a big one. Like, learn how to make your own food, learn how to prepare your own food. That's a huge one. Um, because yeah, if something, I mean, one of the ways it came up for me was if something went south, seriously south in culture and civilization and society right now, what's your plan? Do you know how to identify drinkable water? Do you know what plants are edible? Do you know how to prepare meat? Do you know how to uh, do conflict resolution in a group? Do you know how to create and cohere a group? Like, these are very fundamental questions. And for people who spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to fix the planet, like, yo, if you cannot do these fundamental things, that's probably the work you need to do right now. Like, it is very basic. And I think the general pullout of this for me is just um, you have to want to do it, and that's worth checking in with yourself on. Do I actually care enough to like get my health in shape and learn how to cook and make food? um, the other is put yourself in spaces that let you do that. This is, again, this has been a huge one. The academy and the center of Phoenix culture have been big like attractor basins, just because yeah, you can start to learn, you can start to pull yourself into it, you can start to actually absorb the frequency of peoples and cultures who have already done this for such a long time, for millennia. I think the point I want to leave on that I've also been trying to do is actually taking my relationships as seriously as I take my work. And this is something I think we've both been doing, which is like, if someone gives me a project at work, or if I start building something, right? I don't show up late for my meetings. I have agendas to the meetings, right? I have a structure that I follow. I put time in each week for it. I find that no one takes their relationships as seriously as that, right? Do you actually have a structure to your relationship? Do you actually make space to check in? So actually, I think one of the first things people could try building if they really wanted to experience it is try taking your relationship seriously. And I want to kind of uh yeah, hand this off to you of like, do you have any comments around the relationship protocol stuff?
Yeah,
I
for
think
sure.
that's something actually worth bringing up here.
Mm,
Of the like, because we've been talking about like, stop pointing fingers at people, do your own action, take the immediate next step, and actually probably more than damn near anything else we could focus on, is actually learning how to be a good participant in relationship
Mhm.
is a very accessible, but also I think we've both discovered a highly difficult starting point. Like being in relationship with people, giving a damn about people, going through emotional turmoil with people is really difficult. But if we're going to work on anything, actually, that would be high up on the list to work on.
Yeah. I think this brings us to a fundamental point, which is like, what is culture but a sum total of all the relationships in it?
Yeah, well said. Well said.
And so if we want to shape culture, we have to shape relationships. It's as easy as that. And so, yeah, tons of ideas on the relationship protocols thing. Um, I was just sitting as you were speaking through that whole time, I was just sitting with the question of, you brought up doing versus learning or doing versus thinking. And I was deeply, you know, as you were speaking, there was a lot of confusion of like, where is the divide between doing and learning? Where is the divide between doing and thinking? It seems like, right, there's not clear at all, but also there, it doesn't mean it's not there, right? There's definitely a difference between talking about ideas on a Zoom call and doing conflict management like that. Those are very different experiences, right? And so what was coming up for me was, what is like, what like, it's not entirely obvious to me what embodiment is, or what doing things versus conceptualizing things, like what that difference actually is, or like, how to really it like go about taking action on things outside of the conceptual space, because a lot of the things I try to take action on are conceptual in nature, or a lot of the projects I'm engaging with are very conceptual in nature. And so, sure, I may be writing all day, but the writing is also participating in a project and a larger goal and doing things. So it's like, it's both cognitive and doing at the same time. But I mean, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole at the moment with the relationship protocol stuff. um, yeah, I feel like it's something we've kind of touched on briefly in past conversations, and then we've both kind of gone off and like done our own experimentation with it. I feel like we haven't touched on it too much and like shared our findings yet. But you know, I think romantic relationships are the best container, or like a very generative container for this, and especially family container as well. But I find it a little bit more difficult with the family container because of, there's so many deeply rooted patterns that have been present for decades, and sometimes actually like being intentional about the container is such a huge like paradigm shift for the pattern that it can seem almost insurmountable. And so for me, my experience has been, you know, romantic relationship as being, you meet someone, and then it's like you don't know what their past patterns are, and they don't know what your past patterns are. And so it's very like novel new material that you're working with, and you don't have to break any old patterns. You're just like working with whatever is present because there's not as much of a history. Um, and so I found that I've been asking myself, like, what does it look like to, yeah, create relationship protocols, or I guess in other words, to like, the same way that we strategize about work, in the same way that we kind of take this scientific experimental attitude towards, developing projects in the world. What if we took that same approach to developing depth of connection with another person? And what are the different things you can do to, like, what are the different building blocks that you can use to sort of experiment with that process? And for me, I laid out like maybe 5 to 10. So like, all right, so what are some different activities you can do? I've been starting to experiment mostly eye gazing with eye gazing and circling as the two activities. But there's so many different ones, right? You can also do like, uh tantric practices. I just read a post by Samuel Austin, Live, Learn, Evolve. post on tantra, and it was very simple and to the point. It's like just being super present in intimate act, and really looking the other person in the eye and breathing together and setting the environment right. Like that's a very, it takes work to do that, and I think that's where I'm kind of built, like bridging the two gaps here is like, you know, being super present with someone. I don't want to say it's work, but it's not effortless. Like you have to actually set a deep intention of like, I'm going to sit down and be very present with this person. And so I guess what I found is like it's actually really simple to show up for relationships. It's not easy, but it's actually really simple. And you know, I got stuck in this sort of trying to develop relationship protocols. Like that was the same trap that we were talking about. I started like, I had a point where I'm like, shit, like I have the all the cognitive shit in the framework. It's all here. There's not like everything I need to work with is here. And so I had this sort of wake up call actually like a few days ago. And I was like, all right, what are the action steps? How do I do it? And so recently, actually last night, I like my partner and I've been telling her about all of this stuff. And I basically just told her like, yeah, tonight, do you want to set a container and do eye gazing and circling for this amount of time? And so it's like, yeah, of course I do. Like, let's do it. And so we started with eye gazing, and we just set like a, 10-minute timer. We just like set a 10-minute timer. You know, we put our hand on each other's hearts and we just eye gaze for 10 minutes straight. And then it went really well. And then we set another 5-minute timer. Like we were like, let's keep doing this. And then it really, like, there was so much presence. And I like the sort of Jamie Wheel frame of like stacking different practices. And so, it's just an experimental process, but it's just like doing things. And I would get so stuck so much in the sort of, oh, is it really going to work? Like I've circled and sometimes it's not effective, or sometimes you just get lost and whatever. But we did this practice. And so we started with the eye gazing, and then and that set the container, and then we moved directly into circling after that, and we put on some like gentle classical music in the background, to kind of set the circling environment container as well. And so we were coming fresh out of the eye gazing, and there was an incredible amount of presence, and we went into circling. And like usually circling, it starts with like, I'm noticing, I'm imagining. We said kind of two, like I said, like, I'm noticing, the story I have about this is that, or like when you do this, the story I have about this is that. And then she said that, like something similar back. And then I said it's something similar. And then after like 2 or 3 times back and forth, we kind of just like we stopped. We just like started talking. Like we stopped using the sentence stems, and we just like started talking. But the sort of depth of the container was so deep. And I just contribute that to literally just the act of committing to doing eye gazing, and then committing to hold a certain container where we were both intending to go deep and communicating the fact that that's what we were going to do in this time period. And then we just had like a 2-hour conversation that just went in all sorts of different places, but like the depth of the conversation was like 10 levels deeper than, the sort of surface level, just like playful, fun conversation that we'd had all week. And then, tension would arise, and we'd be like, why is this arising? And like, every time after we show up for the container together, both my girlfriend and I have communicated to each other, like, I feel really connected, and I feel there's no like tension or blame or irritation like at all present, like once that container is stopped. And there's actually like an afterglow effect of like multiple days after that, even like a week. Like I usually tend to like, go back to like my default mode like the next day, but she's told me multiple times, like, whatever we did on Friday, like I'm still feeling that, and it's Monday or Tuesday. And so like, I guess the lessons I've learned from the whole relationship protocol stuff is like, it's as simple as just committing and setting the container and just letting like, it's literally just like committing to create a container and then to let whatever happens in the container. But if you just like, you both commit to like, we're going to sit down right now for this amount of time, and we're going to go deep. We're not going to let ourselves get distracted by all the other bullshit. We're going to just take this time free of distractions to connect. And it's like, for me, that's what, relationship embodiment feels like. And then working through tension, working through difficult emotions, expressing insecurities, expressing fears, expressing judgments. All of these things get brought up when that container is set. And so that's been my experience of relationship protocols. I'm super curious to hear about, what have you been doing in terms of relationship protocols, check-ins, what has been your experience of, embodying and showing up in relationships in the same way as you do in your work.
Yeah, and there's something to your share there of like imagine the difference, maybe not even imagine, I'm sure you and her have experienced it at some point, the difference in how you show up to the rest of life from that state. And I think there's a way actually, this goes back to the like group of people holding the holding the state example, where it's actually like, what if you just were a mobile container for that stuff? Like, what if you actually could cultivate it to the place where you just bring that with you? You bring that energetic container with you where you go because it's just a part of you. And I think that's almost I can't remember quite what the term is, but the unconscious competence thing is to me the best definition of embodiment, where you just move down the stack from what unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, unconscious competence, where it just becomes literally a way of being. It becomes second nature to you, and that's basically the stack of embodiment. Yeah, the relationship protocols. Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it. There's a kind of throwback or footnote or citation to the legendary Jordan Peterson clean your room meme here, because they're like, man, if you're sitting on your computer trying to solve the macroeconomic structures of the world and you can't talk to your mom, like you really got to take a look at that, man. You really got to take a look at that. Or you're just not happy with like relationship dynamics, even again, most fundamentally your relationship to yourself. Like, how do you feel looking at yourself in the mirror? If you feel worse than you do when you're sitting solving the grand problems of the world, you probably have your work cut out for you there. Um, yeah, I mean, my interest in the relationship protocols came from that recognition of like, even though I say there's nothing, there are things in my life more important than my work. My actions don't follow up with that, and certainly not my actions in relationships. Um, I've also been through enough relationships to notice this pattern of there are things that are very important to one or both parties that will never come to the surface unless they have a space that
Mm.
is explicitly given, because they are, why is that? Because they are serious enough to either the other person or the person expressing it, that they don't want to just drop it on them on a random Tuesday night, like just out of nowhere, like, yo bro, we're gonna go into this hour 2 hour conversation. um but a lot of people, I think, and I say this because I've literally heard this in response to me. I think a lot of people are resistant to do something like, let's set up a time at 11 a.m. every Sunday to talk about this, because the answer is always something like, well, yeah, but if we were actually having a good relationship, you wouldn't need to make a space like that. You should just be able to bring it up whenever you want. And it's like, that's not quite true. Because actually, if you're the one wanting to express something very important, serious, boundary violation to someone, you want them to be in the same state with the same level of seriousness.
Mm.
And you never get that if you just drop it on them on a random Tuesday afternoon, Sunday evening, right? Um, so that is to say, the biggest part of the protocols I've been messing with have been weekly and monthly check-ins. Literally a dedicated ritualized space of like, we're going to start with this. We're going to go into a review. We're going to go into moments of significance. That doesn't have to necessarily be positive. It just has to be significant. It can be positive. And then um, basically direct feedback, like positive and critical feedback to the other person. Done eye gazing to open, done hands on heart breaths, meditations to close, but really just a structured container of like, how the fuck are you? Really? I'm like seriously listening. And is there anything you feel called to share? And I mean, it's been going a few months now, but it has been transformative because there's also something. I mean, I think this is true beyond interpersonal relationships of just the mere act of expressing something actually resolves like 80% of it.
Hmm.
Like it's actually remarkable. Like if you have something that's bothering you or if you have something you're insecure about, actually just saying it to another person reduces the tension, the internal tension, like dramatically. And then, of course, if you have a container set up, you can actually carve through the additional 20% of it and actually get uh, very closely to a resolution. But the yeah, the check-ins have been transformative because they give space to those. I mean, this is almost, I think this is true of most of modern culture again. And so it's trying to find like the opposite. But there are several topics, even among partners, that are just like still taboo, right? What are your sexual preferences? How's your financial situation? Are you worried about your parents dying? Like those things will never come up over like morning coffee. They almost always come up in a check-in container of like, look, we've talked about all the other shit. Here is just the rawness that still wants to come out. And yeah, it is deeply cathartic. And um, I mean, not to say that it's been easy. I mean, both of us have had individual check-ins that have been like very difficult. Sometimes we've had some just go completely off the rails, and it's just like you're just upset, crying, sad, triggered about something, and like it's yeah. I mean, it's an experiment, it's a practice, but it is amazing, and I mean, it's helped me do that with other people. Like we've done fairly well. We have like an established kind of check-in cadence. It's also gotten me to like do this with other people. And it's just yeah, it's just been a I think at the end of the day, it's the intentionality. Like you said, it's like, look, I want to make this important to me. Part of something being important is me actually showing up for it and taking it seriously. And so I'm going to do that. I don't care if it seems silly or sounds kind of ridiculous that I want to put something on the calendar for us to talk, but it's like, it actually is transformative. Because I mean, you have random fucking Zoom calls that get on your calendar, but a significant check-in with your partner doesn't make it on. Like that just seems absurd. And it's one of those like very direct ways that I've been trying to point to of like, look, you can talk all you want about the stuff that you value, about the things that are important to you, but like, does your time, energy, and attention actually match that? Because I don't think it does for a lot of people. And I think the reason I actually wanted to like bring this up as a topic and share this with people, one, I think the relationship protocols are extremely powerful, period. But it also is a kind of embodied example of like, well, what if you wanted to take the entire financial system seriously? What if you had an intention to actually try to find a better way to do it than fiat backed currency? What if you wanted to take your food seriously? What does that actually look like? Like you actually build the muscle of being intentional about damn near every aspect of your life. And that in itself, like just that desire, that genuine search will take you very good places because you'll either learn or you'll find something that works for you that you can keep going with. And eventually, particularly when there gets to be a network of people actually sharing their own experiments and sharing their own hypotheses and practices and protocols, um, you start landing on something that is a generative for the collective, beneficial for the individual, and entirely different than the way things are. And I think it is the seed of something that either slows the momentum that we were speaking to earlier or starts diverting it in a way that is that could lead us to perhaps brighter futures.
Yeah. I love it, what feels really important here as well is, one of the traps I've fallen into when trying to enact this a lot has been just overwhelm. There's so many aspects of life to take seriously. there's too many. There's health, there's relationships, there's work. Like even trying to take all those three seriously at the same time is a lot of times like not manageable. Like if I'm trying to like really show up and learn how to cook, really show up for my relationships, really show up for my work, like that about maxes out the amount of time that I have in a day if I'm gonna like take those seriously. And so, it does feel like there is a certain level of like base strategy that has to go into this process, right? And I think it's actually really simple, which is like set a certain number of days that you're going to commit to experimenting with it. And so like in reflecting on it, I think, this has been something that I've come back to over and over again, but I always fall off track and it's hard to sustain it. But like, creating just like a basic, like a super basic calendar, like, all right, from this day to this day, I'm going to do this, like, or like the relationship protocols. It's like, all right, for the next 2 months, we're going to do this check-in once a week and we're going to put it on the calendar. And then we're going to create another slot on the calendar once that's finished to figure out if it worked, to figure out what worked and like to actually reflect on it. And then say you do that. All right, great. Now you've put in effort to like that time, like limited finite amount of time that you're like experimenting with showing up in one way. And then it finishes, you take the reflections and then you're like, all right, I feel, then you sense into what's next, right? So my experience has been like, all right, I say I try to show up for my personal subjective state experience development, like meditation type stuff. Like that's the one I usually try to like put all my eggs in that basket, and then relationships fall by the wayside. So sometimes it's like, all right, I've experimented with this sort of subjective thing enough. It's time to reorient and actually like drop, like intentionally drop all intention to show up for like meditation and just let whatever like is all like the unconscious competence thing just take over, right? And at some point it's like continued experimentation with the goal of like making it so unconscious that it doesn't take up any bandwidth like at all. And so like say you do like a relationship container and it like works, sure, you could like I think it goes like the basic 80-20 rule too. Like, all right, I'm gonna do 20% of the work, which is setting up a 3-month container once a week. That's like 20% of the work is going to get me 80% of the results for showing up for a relationship. I could continue experimenting indefinitely to try to max out that last 20% of results, or I could say, I feel really good about how I'm showing up in my relationship right now. Now I want to learn how to take my health seriously. So I'm going to drop the sort of putting all of my energy and attention into relationships, and I'm gonna be like, yeah, let's maintain this cadence, cool, but like let's not like try to experiment too much more. Maybe at some point later we want to go deeper and we want to experiment more, but for now, like this is a level I'm happy with. And now I'm going to set a 1-month container where twice a week I learn how to cook a new meal, and I go to the store and I plan out the meal. And that's like that takes a lot of time, energy, and attention to like cultivate that space. And you do that and you learn how to cook 10, 20 different raw vegetable, super healthy meals. And then you finish that container and you're like, all right, I have a base level of meals and it's pretty, I have the shopping list. And now all I need to do is pick a meal, take the shopping list and go get all the shit and cook it. And now I'm going to set a container for any other aspect of life, and it's like, for me, it's just like having a little bit of strategy in there like goes a really long way for like showing up in the embodiment stuff.
It's like a OODA loop, right? Observe,
So
orient, decide, act. Um, yeah, I actually want to pull back a point that you brought up. There's something I feel that always needs to be established here, because again, it had to be established for me. I actually had to learn this and learn to embody it, which is I think people need to decouple the idea that seriousness is somehow like stingy and lame and hyper structured. Again, I think we've spoken about this for sure. Uh, like the idea of serious play. Like I grew up playing hockey for 2 decades of my life. And, you know, you get into the finals, you get into the like semifinals, like you are there. You are like, I am fucking serious right now. But it's like a good time. Like it's basically when I say serious, the way I kind of think about it is maybe a more apt metaphor would be something like if people play video games with friends, particularly with friends. I think like there's always uh I mean, I grew up in the Super Smash Bros era. If you have like a 4v4 and everyone's just like leaning forward on the couch, you're like, oh shit's about to go down. Like I'm ready. Like I need to be at my best. I want to be at my best for this. Like I want to put all of myself into it. That's what I mean by serious, not the whole like, you know, stuffy suit and tie, like just follow the rules because I say so. This is a very serious business. Um, where I'm going with this is I actually think if the first step, if you wanted to just take your own life and the collective potential of all of life seriously, is be fucking present. Like, be fucking present for it. Because, look, again, we've made the case of the downward spiral that needs to be shifted out. One of the things that actually rubs salt into that wound is that most people just don't give a fuck, that they're just distracted and may not even be tracking what's happening. Like the idea the idea that it is desirable to disconnect from your own experience is ridiculous. I think that might be a better way to say that, but
I
like
get what
my
you're.
god, the starting point anywhere, the starting point anywhere, if you want to take it seriously, is show the fuck up for it. And I think this is this is where we come full circle again. If you make a decision, like an intention, to both be present and embody as much as you can the frequency and the way of being that you want in the world, everything in your life will orient itself around that. Like this is a fundamental point. um what's an example of this? If you were actually just present with your financial situation a lot, you would take care of it. What I mean by that is like, how often do you look at how much you make? Do you still have outstanding debt that you're just like kind of ostriching, right? Just head in the sand. I don't want to look at this. I don't want to look at this. Like if you were really present with it, if you really felt the pang of that, it would compel you. It would draw you to do something about it. If you were really present with your relationships, you could figure out what they want and what they
Mhm.
need. If you're really present with your body, you'd figure out what kind of foods work best, what kind of eating schedule works best. Um, this is why I think I personally think, and I've experienced this myself, like one of the reasons I agree it's never either or. It's not the external world or the internal development. It's not tools and technology or just internal awakening and psychology. Uh, this is why I do keep coming back quite often to the individual, um, because I think it's been neglected. I think the needle is so far on technology as the thing that's going to save the world. When yes, it is fundamentally necessary. Like you need a tool to build a house, but you also have to have the desire to build a house, right? And there's just God. It sounds, even as I'm about to say it, it just sounds ridiculous. But it's like if we are going to do anything at all for your own life, for the life of your family, for the life of the whole goddamn planet, and all of life and sentient intelligence everywhere, you have to at least show up for it, man. you have to be you have to be fucking present. You have to have the intention to actually do it. And man, if you can start there, I think that'll take you extremely far. But actually, even the intention, this is where it gets fun. I think particularly with meditation, cold showers, stuff like this. Uh, Once you have the intention to be present, you will start noticing how often you're not. And that is where a lot of the practice can start, right? This is what the relationship protocol is. This is what, yeah, personal development work is. This is what awakening work is. It's like, God, it is very difficult for me to even want to or possibly can arrive just in the fucking here and now. But that is where all the work is to be done. And yeah, so if there are blueprints, protocols, practices that individuals can do to actually do that, and if there's a way that we can design the world to help people do that, I mean, that is a place to start. For the first step is just,
Yeah.
are you here? Are you with me? I'm trying to be with you.
So fundamental and surface for me, something we've talked about a lot, which has been the work you need to do on yourself is that which stops you from being present. So everything that takes you out, everything that pulls you out is the work. And so, yeah, we can say like it's like just being present and showing up. And also that reflects in like the relationship protocols as well. Like I think 90% of a relationship protocol is just setting a container where you say, we're going to be present with each other right now. And we're not like, because I think how I make the distinguishment between the container and outside of the container is in the container, there's like a lot of presence. Outside of the container, the amount of time spent in distraction and in avoiding difficult feelings is much higher. Like that's how I almost make the distinguishment between the actual container itself and the rest of life. Is just like, how present are you, how distracted are you, and like you said, a lot gets resolved in that. When recently I had experience where there was, like in the example I was putting forth earlier, there was a little bit of tension in the relationship, and then we both sat down and brought presence to it, and yeah, it kind of just naturally resolved itself because we were both like, well, like we just sat in it. And I've had the experience a lot of these days. I the word that's been coming up a lot is suffering. Like, how long can I sit in my suffering? Because it's like, it's a fact of my experiences. I am suffering, as are everyone on the planet, and it's like everything so much, and we've talked about this as well, so much of society writ large is how effectively can we distract ourselves from the suffering that we feel in every single moment. And so yeah, it just kind of builds on top of the simple, very simple heuristic of, you want to show up for the world, be present, be present in every single situation. And yeah, it feels like everything kind of branches out off from that. If you want to be present, all right, I'm going to go to therapy. That's actually my attempt at resolving things that are stopping me from being present. Oh, I'm going to have a difficult conversation with my mom. That's actually something that's, if you don't do that, it's taking you out of the present moment every time you interact with your mom. It's like just simple stuff like that. And yeah, I like the way the conversation has went. I've got to hop off in 5 minutes, by the way, but um, yeah, I want to start wrapping it up. Uh, but yeah, I really enjoy how it kind of started, cultural frequency stuff, complexity, embodiment, and then just like how much can you be with everything in its entirety without running away from it, as sort of like the pinnacle of all of the complex topics and systems change and all that. It kind of like, I feel like it's the, we've talked about this meme before of like mindless doesn't know what's happening, super complex, everything is technical, mindless simplicity, or like mindful simplicity, and it's like the simplicity on the other side of complexity is kind of like my experience of like, this conversation and just bringing it to presence and showing up.
Yeah. I mean, this is why the the internal external is fundamentally inseparable, because actually probably the first place to start for people is, have you grieved the state of the world? Like, have you actually taken a look at the amount of shit going on, just the absolute buffoonery, and just felt it and not bypassed it, not immediately started dreaming about what a different one would look like? I actually just like fucking wept for the people that are dying. The fact that it was 60 degrees Celsius in India this week, like just stupid amounts of shit going on. Yeah, like feel it, like don't run away from it. And yeah, because there's a part of it of I mean, those stories of shame, guilt, fear, there's a incompleteness like at the seed of that, like I'm not good enough, I'm not here yet, something about me is missing. And that's what I mean. Like when I look out in the world, so much of what I see is like, God, it's a compensation for something that's not even true, which is you're not incomplete. And if you were actually present with yourself, you'd realize the completeness of your experience and of everything that you fucking are. um so yeah, they can't be separated. And yeah, you know, if you want to do big culture stuff, do big self stuff, grow, increase the capacity of what you can handle, and go out into the world. Yeah, dude, this was beautiful. Thank you. It's all fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me today.